Congressman, Secretary Mayorkas today said that there was no crisis and that the border is secure, something that was reiterated by Press Secretary Psaki. Is that the case?
No, not at all. In fact, it's a big fat whopper. We have literally over 5,000 people coming through that are getting apprehended daily, and that doesn't count the known getaways. So this is a massive, we don't have control over the border. And but even Jay Johnson and Eric Holder used to say, if it's 1,000 people or more a day that we apprehend, it's a bad day, it's a crisis. We're talking 5 times that much. We're looking at maybe 140,000 or so in the month of March alone. And the number of unaccompanied minors has tripled. That's amazing. And then they're just in denial. But don't forget, if it's not a crisis, why in the world do you have these facilities already filled to overflowing, and now you're busing people up to the Dallas Convention Center? All the indications from people down on the border that I talked to, the agents, people who live along the border, the mayors who are saying, please stop letting these people loose in our communities. Guess what that means? It means it's a crisis.
I mean, there's no doubt that it's a crisis. And, you know, for far less numbers, President Trump, for example, declared a national emergency in order to deal with the overflow prior to the COVID pandemic. But here we are. And as you mentioned, it's not only a crisis. You could argue that this is the worst crisis that we've ever had when it comes to the border in terms of sheer numbers. But the Biden administration refuses to acknowledge it. But many people say that it's their messaging that caused this very issue. Do you think that's the case?
I absolutely do. And Mayorkas himself has said, look, we're going to have the highest number perhaps that we've ever had in this next few months. And guess what? That's because of their policies. If you look back for 35 years, any time that there's discussion about amnesty, and by the way, the House just voted on 2 amnesty bills today, anytime you talk about amnesty, guess what? You have a correlative amount of increased illegal border crossings. That's what's happening. The cartels are advertising down there. NGOs are advertising down there in Mexico and the Northern Triangle states. And we have just an influx like you just can't imagine. And it's because of the announcements of the Biden team, what they're doing with asylum now, what they're doing with catch and release now, and that they're getting rid of the MPP program, which is the Remain in Mexico policy. And they terminated the agreements and the contracts the Trump administration worked out with El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras to keep people there, and it slowed down the people that were coming across the border. This is a crisis. They built it. They own it.
Yeah, and you know, even when it comes to foreign governments as well, I mean, the Trump administration was working with them in order to alleviate this problem. And it just seems completely counterintuitive, the approach that the Biden administration is now taking, because they want to be the diplomatic ones, but they are not following through on diplomacy, working with other countries. So I guess the emphasis now does come back to lawmakers here in the United States. I mean, I feel like for the most part, many people know how to address this problem, how to increase border security. But as you mentioned, right now the conversation is amnesty. Are you hopeful at all that perhaps that conversation could be amnesty, maybe in exchange for border wall funding or anything like that? Or do you think that Democrats are controlling this right now and they don't know how to handle this situation?
Well, I would say this, that they're pleased with amnesty, they're pleased with the number of people coming across, they're pleased with an open border policy. What they are surprised at a little bit is that it's happening so quickly. I think they thought it would be more measured and they could regulate it. That's why they're saying, well, don't come just yet. The reality is they're not interested in building a fence, they're not interested in building the necessary facilities. They're not interested in closing loopholes that provide the incentives. In fact, they want to provide the incentives. Why is that? They're looking to actually create a voting bloc at some point in the future here. And this is exactly what they want. And they're getting that. They just didn't know it was going to happen so quickly, I believe.
And you can see that also with the agenda that's coming up on Capitol Hill. I mean, H.R. 1, for example, voting reforms within itself. Amnesty, as you just mentioned, would increase the number of new voters in this country by several million. And if the border remains porous, I mean, it's a problem that is going to remain persistent. I mean, it's not going to get better just because the season changes or the messaging stops or anything like that. If people see an opportunity, they're going to follow through on that opportunity. So acknowledging that point, how should Republicans be responding? Is it an economic argument saying that, you know, this hurts wages for Americans here? Is it a national security argument? Axios reported that there were 4 people detained who were on an FBI terrorist watch list that the names matched. What is the Republican response to this crisis?
Well, you're right. It's an all hands on deck. So we need states where you have county officials that can bring state charges against people who are committing human trafficking, drug trafficking, and sex trafficking. We need those to be prosecuted at the state level because they're not going to prosecute them at the federal level. You need this notion we need to get out there and provide the narrative about the economic disadvantages that's going to come in when you bring in millions and millions of low-skilled, low-wage workers. They're going to displace American workers, and that's not good for the people who traditionally have those jobs. So that's bad. So you got to do it all hands on deck. But when you talk about national security, you really hit the home run because people understand how porous our border is. They don't understand perhaps that we get people from over 150 nations a year sneaking into our country. So they found 4 people that seem to be on that terrorist watch list. But don't forget that just 2 weeks ago, they found 11 people from Iran sneaking across the Arizona border. And so you have a plethora of people from all countries practically in the world, and some of those are very dangerous places, and some of these people coming across are very dangerous. Don't forget also the #1 growth area is young men ages 14 to 17, and a lot of those are coming through who are MS-13 and other gangs coming from Central America and Mexico. So it is a national security issue, and people understand that because they see it in their communities, whether it's fentanyl or whether it's other crime. They become aware of it, and it's because it's no longer just a border issue, it's a national issue.
Yeah, and I have conversations with people that are from San Francisco or Los Angeles, and they're starting to see this firsthand themselves. They're starting to see that it's not just at the border itself. A lot of these people are, for example, committing crimes in different states, and these states are not following through on 3-strike rules or anything like that. I mean, there's a lot of I would say, apart from the idea that there's no action being taken, I think a lot of people are fearful that no action will be taken. There's not even a sense of optimism when it comes to this issue. So before I let you go, do you agree? Are you optimistic on this front, or are you getting kind of fearful?
Well, I'm not overly optimistic right now because the Democrats have frozen us out of any discussions. I offered, I think, 20 amendments on this latest amnesty bill. They would not even consider a single one. We couldn't even have a discussion. So I'm not optimistic. I am very pessimistic. And, this Biden needs to own it, but Republicans need to do 2 things. We need to stand in the way as much as we possibly can, and that means you should stand in the way procedurally. And then the other thing we have to do is we have to make sure that people get the word out like you're doing tonight, like we're discussing tonight, the facts, and we need to get that out to as many people in the country as we possibly can so they can then contact their representatives and say, you've got to stop this because it's inhumane for people coming across the border. It's inhumane to the people who are on our side of the border. And the people who are making these policy decisions, they need to hear it and they need to know it from the American people.
You're exactly right. Nobody is benefiting from this current situation. But Representative, I really appreciate you coming on the show tonight. Thank you.